from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT. Welcome to a little strategic risk assessment talk. And I'm going to talk about a number of things tied to, shall we say, war, conflict around the world, some of the things that are, in the news, but also a little background on some of these things in the news, a little bit of, dare I paraphrase Saturday Night Live, strategery, I think was the term that was used. I don't know if that was Saturday Night Live or maybe that was just a stand-up thing. But anyway, let me get into this. Let me talk about Ukraine to start off. Something that may have been kind of lost in the news cycle is the reports that Ukraine is involved in an offensive operation into the Belgorod Oblast. Now, for reference, they were in Kursk, which was a little bit to the west. That was Oblast is a term for basically province or state in Russian and Ukrainian parlance, if you will. And they were involved in Kursk, and they went up into Kursk, and they had a very successful incursion. Eventually, the Russians shifted their forces, and they were forced to retrograde, if you will, withdraw from Kursk. Part of that being a tactical innovation on the battlefield, where the electronic warfare capability that Ukraine had developed and was using to great effect, interfering with drones, had been overcome by the drones using fiber optic lines, basically a hard line as they're flying the drone. Now, that's an innovation on the battlefield. I can think of several ways that could be countered very quickly on the battlefield. But for the short period of time, it was something new. They didn't have those things in place to counter it, and they were able to use these drones to great effect for basically targeting Ukrainian units, Ukrainian personnel, and certainly caused a lot of mayhem with Ukrainian lines. And the Ukrainians withdrew down south and pretty much are out of Kursk. Now, with all that said, there was some stuff, and I don't know why the White House was repeating this, that the Russians had encircled these Ukrainian troops and were about to destroy them. And I don't know where that came from, because the Russians had not encircled the Ukrainian troops. The Ukrainian troops did fall back rather quickly, but they were never encircled nor threatened with complete destruction. That was a Kremlin talking point that for some reason ended up as a U.S. talking point. I don't know why that ever came out. Anyway, they pulled back. Now, here's the thing about Kursk and with Belgorod Oblast and any area in Russia. Ukraine has no designs, no intent on seizing and holding Russian territory. There is no purpose for doing that. Their entire war goal, if you will, their aims are simply to recover and secure Ukrainian sovereign territory. That's it. So when they do these things where they go into Russia, there is an operational, a tactical, to some degree, a certain strategic reason why they do it, but it's not because they want to hold this territory. So when they went up to Kursk, there was never an intent to hold that territory. In Belgorod, I don't think there's any intent to hold that territory in Belgorod. However, as something to force the Russians to react to what's going on, these are very useful things to do. And that's what I think the Belgorod operation is. It's to force the Russians to react. It's also taking advantage of a simple battlefield reality, which is kind of true in all of life. You can't protect everything. When you shift forces to Kursk to deal with the Kursk issues, those forces got to come from somewhere. And in this case, the forces really came off, were basically shifted around up north, but definitely, eventually, much to the chagrin of the Russians, they had to pull units off the line in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, and move those forces up and around to deal with the Kursk issue. As they did that, they weakened the Russian lines in the Donbass, and Ukraine actually started conducting, not just taking pressure off defending their lines, but they were actually able to turn around and start pushing the other way. They started taking villages and towns that they had lost to the Russians previously. In other words, the Ukrainians were finally on the offensive in the eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass. So that part of it was actually very effective. Stopped the Russian offensive, or at least slowed down significantly Russian offensive action, and in some places actually able to push the Russians back. So that was successful. Now, what I am assuming happened here, and they wouldn't be doing it otherwise, is as they were moving all their forces around, they kind of did the same thing in Belgorod that they had initially done in Kursk, which is they left the place relatively undefended or underdefended. In Kursk, one of the reasons they went up there was they were looking across everything. They said the Russians hardly have any forces in Kursk Oblast. They put everything on the line, if you will, with the Ukrainian front, that stretches down through the Donbass into Zaporizhia, Kherson. They put everything on the line there, but they've left these areas up north kind of open. And even though they have in the past invaded from the north, even if you go over to the next oblast over, there is a Russian incursion into the Kharkiv Oblast in Ukraine. Small Russian incursion, not a big one, but it's there. Even though they've done all that, they had probably left this area open. They left a gap or a seam on the battlefield. And in maneuver warfare, you look for gaps and seams. You look for areas where you can gain advantage, where you can push your forces through. And I think that's exactly what the Ukrainians have done. They have pushed their forces through up into Belgorod, and they're going to force the Russians to react, which will probably force the Russians to have to move more forces around. And now the Russians have the problem of they have to fully defend Kursk Oblast next door because they know what the Ukrainians can do and just did. And now they're having to shift forces over to defend the next oblast, which is Belgorod. And that's a pretty big thing. One thing I would point out, one thing I really should point out is, and you've probably picked up on this, is the name of the oblast is Belgorod. And in Belgorod, like with Kursk Oblast, there is actually a city that has the same name. Belgorod is a city. It has been under fire for quite some time in this war by Ukraine. One of the reasons is it's pretty dang close to the border. It's only 25 miles north of the Ukrainian border. That's about 40 kilometers. So there's a lot of things that can range it. In fact, potentially long-range artillery can actually hit Belgorod if it was put right up on the border, although I don't think you'd want to put your artillery right up on the border. But that just gives you an idea of how close that is. So they've been taking hits in that city. Now you have the Ukrainians going up north. If the Ukrainians were able to do something in Belgorod that they were not able to do in Kursk, which is forces actually take that city, that would be a psychological blow to Putin. And in the past, pro-Ukrainian, Russian militia, pro-Ukrainian, have gone up there and done these rather extensive raids, if you will, shooting out of Ukraine, going up into the oblast, actually getting up into the urban area of Belgorod before having to pull back. So this is not something that's fanciful or maybe could it happen. It's something that you can actually track back and say, well, it kind of did happen at one point. And in this case, they could go up there and potentially take the city and actually hold the city. That's a very distinct possibility. Regardless of whether they do or don't, again, it's not Ukraine's war goal to seize Belgorod. They are not an invading force. They are not out there for conquest. There is nothing that they're going to get from it other than they could go up there. Certainly they could. It's a key area. It's a big logistics hub. So they could certainly go in there and cause tremendous damage and mayhem to all the logistics capability that Belgorod represents to the Russians and then simply pull back. That's certainly an option. Then I'm sure that if they get that far, that would be part of their plan to do so, if they could pull that off. But it's going to force the Russians to react all upon their lines. And what's interesting is that they're reacting at a time when there are multiple reports that Russia is preparing for some sort of 6 to 9 month offensive operation. And reportedly, the offensive operation will be across the entire front line of the Ukraine war, which is rather interesting. Now, if they're looking at doing the entire front line, I would point out that Belgorod Oblast was not part of that front line. In fact, it's off to the side. So they've already kind of done a maneuver where they went up an exposed flank. It does remind me in some ways of Operation Desert Storm, where the thinking of the Russian-trained, Soviet-trained Iraqis was that the U.S. and its coalition forces would shoot right up from the south into Kuwait in order to liberate Kuwait. And as it turns out, the attack from the south was a supporting attack to fix the Iraqis in place, while the main effort actually shot up on the side, the Great Hook Maneuver that went up there. Now, of course, part of that supporting effort was the Marine Corps, and the Marines just have a tendency that when we're in the offense, we tend to move very quickly, completely overwhelming and destroying our enemy. Again, it happened, and so by the time the Hook Maneuver was fully successful, the Marines had already taken Kuwait City and kind of secured and basically fulfilled the entire operational objectives. That's what happens when Marines are working with the Army. They tend to overachieve, and historically that has always disappointed the Army because they tend to look, less victorious in comparison. But I digress. I shall not spend more time on that. Anyway, what the Ukrainians have done is basically do kind of not a hook, but they've definitely gone up an exposed flank, if you will, and they're forcing the Russians to move. This could upset the timing of the Russians. If the Russians don't move quickly, they could lose Belgorod to the Ukrainians. If they do move quickly, they're going to take their forces out of place that they were hoping to use in this offensive. So right now, the Russians are trying to figure out what they're going to do with this. The other thing I'd like to point out is, if you're planning to attack everywhere, kind of like with defending everywhere, you're really kind of attacking nowhere. If you're planning on using the same forces that you have or slightly reinforced and pushing across the entire front, well, I think you've missed the principle of mass when it comes to warfighting. You're supposed to mass your forces in order to make a penetration. Now, I'm not saying that the Russians may not have a plan to mass their forces in one area or multiple areas, but the reports are coming out is that they plan to attack across the entire front. And frankly, with the way the Russians have been fighting, is kind of illogical as a plan like that would sound. I wouldn't put it past the Russians to actually try and do something as broad spectrum as that. And I imagine it'll put tremendous pressure on the Ukrainians. Although with that said, if the Russians stay true to form, there's no reason to think they won't, although they're probably going to try and use those fiber optic controlled drones to great effect, which I'm anticipating the Ukrainians already have a plan in effect on how to defeat those drones. But if they plan to do that, I think the Russians are going to take phenomenal losses again. Now, I would point out that just not long ago, the Russians surpassed 900,000 troops lost on the battlefield. There is some debate. If you look at the previous Ukrainian way that they would report it was that they were killed, KIA, killed in action on the battlefield. More recently, some of the Ukrainian reporting says losses as in, killed or wounded. The U.S. and other Western countries have often looked at this and said killed or wounded. Now, with the wounded, because of the incredibly poor state of Russian medical capability, so bad that they were even shipping Russian troops to North Korea to receive medical treatment. I can't imagine anything worse than having to go to North Korea for medical treatment. They can't even take care of their own people on any given day. They are notoriously the worst medical capability probably of any country in the world, or at least one of the very worst. Well, that's how bad it is. So when they say wounded, that may be a way of saying, yeah, you're not dead right now, but you're probably going to die in the near future. And so I'm not saying that all those are wounded or died, but I will say, or have died, but I will say that there's probably a number of them that were medically evacuated from the battlefield that did not fare well in the coming weeks or months because of the horrible state of Russian medical care. So that, I just want to throw it out there. Anyway, they surpassed 900,000. If they kick off this offensive and do everything I've been saying for some time, I expect their losses to surpass 1 million. I think that's a significant number, 1 million in the course of this war. And if they kick off this offensive, say in April or something, if it's a spring offensive, I could see that probably getting up there to to 1 million, maybe even before June. That's very possible. And I don't know if that's going to have an effect on the body politic within Russia. They seem to be almost immune to the losses of the war. But Russia's economy is in desperate straits, if you will. It's used up its war reserve fund for the most part. They had this kind of reserve fund when the war started. It's a pretty significant amount of money that had been set aside if and when they ever needed to use it. Well, they've kind of burned through that over the last 3 years, and they have been selling their gold reserves. And they have quite a bit of gold reserves, but they've been burning through that pretty quick as well. The only other thing they have that really keeps them going is oil. They sell oil. The big countries they sell oil to, obviously a number of countries around the world, a number of the African countries will buy their oil. There are countries elsewhere in Asia, but particularly India and China have been big consumers of Russian oil. And even before the war started, Russia was considered essentially a big petrostate. It was, I think, John McCain often referred to it as a big gas station. That the Russian economy, whatever that Soviet Union industrial economy, diversified across a number of sectors, whatever that was, had long since dissipated. And really what Russia was a big oil state, oil and gas. That was their big exports. That's what kept them afloat. As sanctions started choking off their ability to do things, not the least of which is Ukraine not that long ago shut off the last pipeline. I was really surprised to see it was still working. The last pipeline across its territory with Russian oil and gas, I should say. And then as Europe has basically cut itself off from a dependence on Russian oil and gas across the board, Russia has fewer places to sell its oil and gas. Just recently, India actually seized one of the Russian ships, these what they call dark tankers. And they call them dark tankers because when they run, they tend to turn off their AIS system, which identifies them as a ship on the water. A very, very dangerous practice, particularly in very confined waterways like the Mediterranean, not to mention other areas of the world like the Baltic Sea, and incredibly dangerous stuff. And a lot of these tankers are really, they've got these tankers that are just horrible condition. They're really not that seaworthy, and the crews are not that good. Gee, what could possibly go wrong with poorly trained, poorly capable crews in a tanker that's not seaworthy? Well, you can imagine what everybody's worried about. Anyway, India has just seized one of its tankers. First time we've seen India really step up like this. I don't know if this is an outcome of the mini summit, between Modi and Trump back in Washington, D.C., but it is interesting to see India do that. And I should mention that if Russian oil was to disappear, that there is actually quite a bit of oil out there. Saudi Arabia could definitely jump its production up greatly. The U.S. has largely replaced the gas and oil dependency that was previously on Russia throughout Europe. We've been shipping liquefied natural gas and shipping oil at a rather prodigious rate all around the world. So if India is probably in a position where they could do this. Now they're not, they received something of a benefit from this economically because the Russian oil was really cheap. And so that was one advantage they had. However, that may change. One of the things that President Trump has just stated, and he did this, of all things, with NBC, with the anchor for Meet the Press, which I find interesting because NBC and MSNBC part of the same company. And frankly, politically speaking, President Trump probably not a big fan of MSNBC, and he has said disparaging things about NBC more than once in the past. Anyway, he was interviewed, and one of the things he talked about was his frustration with Putin on the ceasefire and eventual peace negotiations. The term he used was pissed off. That's a quote unquote situation with Putin over this entire situation. And one of the things he's been kind of alluding to possible more sanctions being added on to Russia, to which many of us who've looked at this go, what more sanctions could you add on? What are you thinking of doing? And with that, he kind of explained that he was talking about basically indirect sanctions, second, third order sanctions, basically imposing large tariffs on countries that import Russian oil. Now, that's a fascinating possibility. And of course, the two countries that immediately come to mind are India and China. And I'm kind of wondering if maybe this wasn't something that was discussed previously with India, that at some point, if Putin doesn't play ball, if he doesn't come to some sort of agreement on Ukraine, and certainly looking at Putin's actions and words, it didn't look like Putin felt that he needed to come to some sort of agreement with Ukraine. And every time they seem to have a deal in place, literally the next day, Putin throws out 30 monkey wrenches on top of it, and the deal completely falls through. Well, anyway, with that said, he may have already signaled to Modi that the U.S. was looking at doing something like this. And obviously, for Modi in India, he would probably say, well, let's figure out a way that we can basically disconnect ourselves from a dependency on Russian oil. And that may be what we're seeing getting underway. I'm not saying it's underway, but it may be something that's getting started, is that this will happen. Because right now, India doesn't want to see more tariffs from the U.S. Frankly, I don't think China wants to see more tariffs from the U.S. And China, I believe, is the biggest importer of Russian oil across the board. So this may have some effect. Now, is it going to happen? Well, words, I have to tell you, President Trump has said a lot of things about tariffs. He has threatened tariffs, and as soon as he threatens them, he turns around and he removes the threat of tariffs. I don't know. He's keeps talking. April 2nd is the big day when the tariffs go in place. But, everyone's kind of sitting there wondering if things may change very shortly in that same week. And it's not impossible. Tariffs get imposed and then tariffs get removed. It's to be seen what will happen with this. But if that was to take place, if those tariffs were put in place, and if India and China dramatically decrease the amount of oil that they were importing from Russia, or in the case of India, possibly even stopped importing oil from Russia, that would have a huge effect on Russia. It would have a huge effect on Putin. It would have an enormous effect on Putin's ability to keep paying for this war. Many experts have looked at this thing, looked at the Russian economy, how it's falling apart, and they have said that sometime in late 2025 or in 2026, we're going to see the Russian economy start sputtering out, if not collapsing. In fact, many say that in 2026, the Russian economy could completely collapse if nothing else big happens. Certainly, Putin would love to see whatever he does with and this is why he keeps pushing it. This is why he keeps throwing those monkey wrenches in, is he says, okay, but we want to see the sanctions removed, particularly our ability to receive financial transfers for the sale of oil around the world, blah, blah, blah. He knows full well that he needs to keep selling oil around the world if he's going to keep the Russian economy from sputtering out. And if President Trump goes this other direction, which would be a dramatic turn if he does, but if he starts putting on those second indirect sanctions, if you will, those second order sanctions, that could have an immediate effect. That, obviously it would definitely incentivize Russia to come to some sort of deal, so it may all be for naught. But if it happens and Russia does not come to some sort of deal, if in Putin's calculus it's just simply not worth trying to entertain some sort of ceasefire or peace deal as things stand, and maybe it sounds like, certainly all indications are that he's putting all of his effort into pushing for this big offensive, and his thinking is that he's going to, and if you get into his calculus, he wants to take the ground that he claims. He wants to take, he's already got Crimea, but he wants to take all of the provinces, the 4 remaining provinces. He wants to take their territory in entirety. He has not achieved that goal. There's still a lot of that territory that is still held by Ukraine. I think in his mind, he'd like to be able to militarily seize those oblasts, them be able to say, okay, we are going to stop the war, and part of the peace deal will be that Ukraine recognizes Russian sovereignty over all 5 of these oblasts that would include Crimea in the south, and that this would be the end state of the war. I think in his mind, that's where he thinks he can go. I think the reality is that if the U.S. was to impose as secondary sanctions, it would cause a big dent in the Russian income stream. He would have a tough time keeping the war going throughout the summer into the fall. I also think that when they pass 1 million troops lost, that may have some sort of political effect, depending on everything else that's happening in Russia. So we'll see what's going on. We'll see what happens there, but I do think that's something we have to watch for because I think it's potentially a big deal. All right. Now, the revised mineral deal that was sent over to Zelensky apparently has a lot of provisions which are causing pause. The U.S. went back and basically put more conditions on this, and everything I'm saying is that President Zelensky and the Ukrainians are definitely slow rolling the review of this deal. It's not the same deal they had before, and I wouldn't be surprised if they come back with a counteroffer. Now, one of the things that really irritates the Ukrainians is that President Trump, when he makes his statements about how much money the U.S. has sent to Ukraine, he keeps saying $350 billion. There is no math that anyone can find that comes up with $350 billion. At most, it's about half that amount that has been sent, and actually out of that, about $50 billion is in the receivable thing, which is money that Congress has allocated that has not yet gone to Ukraine. All right, so he keeps saying $350 billion. I think that's a negotiating thing he's doing, stating that, and he keeps stating it over and over again as $350 billion. I kind of get frustrated when I hear some around him who know a lot better repeating that same claim because, well, frankly, they know a lot better. I think he's stating it as a negotiating point to try and get more concessions, consideration in whatever deal is struck with Ukraine. But that obviously is a big problem with Ukraine, and they're probably looking at this minerals deal, and they're probably very frustrated with what's in there. So I just think that's just something that's going to take a while. Now, that could become another huge point of contention, and who knows, Trump may go back and decide to cut off aid and stop all sharing of intelligence and a variety of other things, which leads to Europe. Europe is trying to ramp up to kind of fill the void of the uncertain U.S. support for Ukraine. They don't have the defense industrial base that can literally replace what the U.S. brings to the fight, if you will. In fact, one of the things that all the NATO nations are looking at is the fact that they just don't produce that many arms anymore. They have been underinvesting in defense for so many decades that their industrial base for defense needs is woeful, to say the least. Now, there's some big changes going on. Germany has basically said, we will borrow money. They had always had, we won't borrow money for defense things. Well, now they're saying they will. And across NATO, across the board, there's a commitment to about $840 billion over the next few years or several years to build up NATO's ability to defend itself and withstand a possible military action invasion, if you will, by Russia. Of course, countries that have been really stepping up are the ones on the front lines. If you look at Finland, they've always been there, leaning forward. The Baltic states are very much leaning forward. That's Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Poland is putting pretty close to 5% of its gross domestic product into defense. They're moving up really fast. But then you have countries further back. Great Britain, despite everything they say, well below 2% of their GDP in defense matters. France has to catch up a phenomenal amount. Germany has to catch up a phenomenal amount. Denmark, who is a little upset with the U.S. over the whole Greenland thing, and the U.S. says Denmark can't defend Greenland. Well, the truth is, yeah, Denmark can't defend Greenland because they can't really even defend Denmark if there was a big war. They have been underinvesting in defense for a very long time. I am not taking away from the phenomenal contribution they made in the war on terror, the tremendous sacrifices they made on the battlefields of Iraq and certainly over in Afghanistan, and other things that they have done over the many years where they have put their forces in harm's way and taken significant losses as part of that effort. they have truly been great allies. But with that said, while they're taking losses, they just weren't shifting their economy to defense needs. They weren't looking at the defense of Denmark, nor were they looking at the larger defense of all the territory they hold, which includes Greenland. So despite everything, and as much as it frustrates me to see U.S.-Danish relations at such a low ebb, there is an element of truth that Denmark has to step up. And that's not just true of Denmark. There's other countries in NATO. If you look certainly towards the south, like Spain has been tremendously underinvesting. I think at one point, maybe 1.25% of their GDP. Italy's been underinvesting. In other words, a lot of these countries need to step up and put a lot more investment into their own defense needs, which is another way of saying that, again, they don't have the capability of just instantly replacing what the U.S. is bringing to Ukraine. So I do think that over time that will shift, but it's just not there now. All right. So, and finally, let me end with what's going on with Gaza. Interestingly, about 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a month ago, Steve Witkoff, the envoy from the U.S. to the Middle East, also the envoy with Ukraine, Russia, had basically talked about extending the Phase 1 ceasefire that ended on 1 March in Gaza. No Phase 2 ever got negotiated. No Phase 2 was ever agreed upon. And Hamas had basically said, nope, we're not going to agree to a Phase 1 extension. And eventually, what this led to was aid got cut off that was going in there because that was part of the Phase 1 agreement. And then they said, well, Israel basically said, since we're not going anywhere, they started doing military action. And all of a sudden, they did it with a little bit of shock and awe with some major military strikes. And then they started putting troops back in there, taking key areas and telling folks in certain parts of northern Gaza that they had to get out of there, that was going to be a battleground. All right. That's all been going on. In the interim, the Arab countries looking at what's going on there, with Egypt in the lead. Egypt eventually came out with a proposal, and keep in mind that Egypt and some of these Arab countries talked directly to Hamas. The U.S., Israel talked indirectly to Hamas, but they talked directly to Hamas, basically emulating what Steve Witkoff has put out there, that there would be another ceasefire for a series of weeks, and in that time there would be a smaller release of hostages, about 5 living hostages. I should mention there's about 59 hostages that are held, but less than half of those are assessed as still being alive. So 5 is a significant number. One of the 5 mentioned was an Israeli-American that was being held. Anyway, the Egyptians have put that out there, and Hamas finally, belatedly, after this had been out there, finally said, okay, we agree to it. However, by that time, Israel had definitely shifted its position. The U.S. had shifted its position. And what Israel was looking at was the success of its military pressure combined with diplomatic pressure and forcing Hamas to do things. Now, the Arab countries, to include Egypt, have all agreed that Hamas will not be the governing entity within Gaza when this is all done. They have agreed to that. What Israel is now thrown in is that Hamas needs to A, lay down its arms, and B, figure out where they're going to go. But Hamas has got to go. That's where it sits right now. This is a big shift. I don't know what's going to happen. In the past, there have been these dramatic moves of Palestinian fighters to other countries. I would point to the 1980s with what happened up in Beirut and Lebanon with the PLO. So there could be some significant changes that take place here. I'm just kind of waiting to see what happens. The Hamas right now says there's no way. That's a red line. They're not going to lay down their arms, but we'll see what happens. Anyway, a lot going on. I'm not going to talk about everything in Syria and certainly in Lebanon and elsewhere because, frankly, we only have so much time. But I hope you enjoy this Strat, and hopefully you're getting this at stratpodcast.com. It is available, Captivate, Apple. You can get this on YouTube. Basically, any major platform for podcasts it's available on. And then, of course, you can always go on YouTube and go to Hal Kempfer TV, which has all of my news, almost daily news hits, as they like to say in the business, segments where I'm being interviewed on various different topics tied to national security, global security, and sometimes homeland security. Anyway, hope you enjoy this, and I hope you tune in for the next Strat after this one.